Portanto, fiquem calmos, fiquem aqui. Tem o resto do café que sobrou aí para todo mundo. Se precisar, dormem aqui. Não, a gente espera que resolva logo, mas neste momento os táxis não estão entrando nem saindo. Então, acalmar aqui. Ok. Depois dessa trágica notícia e do banho de água fria que nós vimos nas apresentações tanto da Dália quanto do Lincoln Pratson sobre a rentabilidade da estocagem lá e os mercados, I invite now Dr. Professor Ethan Elkind of University of California at Berkeley and Los Angeles to tell us how energy storage in California, how law and policy has helped to create a growing market. The floor is yours.
Okay. Obrigado. Eu falo não muito português. Eu falo pouco mais espanhol, but I'll speak in English today. And thank you to the translators for sticking through this conference. Thank you, Professor Sauer, Nilton, Mariana, everyone for allowing me to be here today. So I don't know about Brazil, but in the United States, when a lawyer shows up, it's not always a good thing. But in this case, with energy storage, it's really important to have law and policy talking to the engineers, to the experts on the electricity management side, because really in a growing market with a new technology, you have to work together. And that's the story in California, where we've had lawyers, policymakers working with energy storage experts, grid managers, utilities, to arrive at a place where we now are starting to see a really vibrant market for energy storage in California. So that's what I'm going to talk about with this presentation. I should also mention that we have 3 reports at UC Berkeley Law that we've done on energy storage. The first one, Professor Sauer mentioned, it was a study back in 2012 for the California Energy Commission. We worked with Dr. Gravely, who you heard from yesterday. But we've also done a couple reports, policy reports. One is the power of energy storage. I left a few copies out there. This one we did back in 2010, and so much has changed. So it's almost interesting to see what we wrote back in 2010 and where we are today. And the second one, we looked at used electric vehicle batteries and what we could do to repurpose used electric vehicle batteries. So I'll talk a bit about all 3 of those reports in this presentation. So first of all, let's start from the beginning in California, why California originally cared about energy storage at all. Well, the big driver, as Dr. Mooney and others have talked about, is climate change. So California, flooding, sea level rise, this is San Francisco, and the rise of extreme weather events. This is a chart actually that the insurance industry put together. This shows how, if we look at the trend lines here, extreme weather events and the damage that they cause. So in California, this is something that we're very concerned about because our climate, maybe similar to here in Brazil, is very important to our way of life, our agricultural sector. We have a lot of infrastructure along the coastlines, and we have a population in California that really wants to take action on the environment. We have a long history dealing with smog in Los Angeles and requiring automakers to clean up their cars through things like catalytic converters. So we have this long history of setting strong environmental standards, even when industry says, no, we can't do it. It's too expensive. It's going to cost everybody too much money. But we've seen success. We've seen innovation. And we sort of go on that faith that if we create a target, we create a strong set of policies, that industry will respond. And we've started to see that with the energy storage industry. So, and of course, we have extreme weather, but we also have a lot more energy demand. This is a photo from China. We're expected to see energy demand worldwide increase by potentially 50% through 2030 as China develops, as India develops. So we know that the problem is just going to get worse, and we have to transition to a cleaner way to power our economy. So in California, we've talked a little bit about this, but I can talk about our law and policy response. We set a goal we passed a law in 2006 that by 2020 we would return our greenhouse gas footprint to 1990 levels. And so that's that number there. It's sort of a bending the curve type of a law. And we're on track to meet this, in some part thanks to the recession back in 2009, but also because we've seen huge advances in our electricity system. And then we just passed a law a couple years ago that by 2030, we would reduce below 1990 levels of emissions by 40%. With the ultimate goal by 2050, we would bring down those emissions to 80 to 90% below 1990 levels of greenhouse gas emissions. And we didn't just make these numbers up. These numbers track what the scientists tell us we have to do to try to stabilize the climate at a level that we can still thrive and have a civilization that we can all enjoy. And just to put this in another perspective, out to 2020, it means about 1% greenhouse gas reduction per year. But now, starting 2020 down to 2050, we're looking at 5% reductions per year in greenhouse gas emissions. You know, to make that personal, that would be like everybody in this room figuring out how every year from 2020 on, you're going to reduce your personal carbon footprint by 5% a year. So that's a major lift. And it's going to require, in California, and this is a chart here that shows our greenhouse gas emissions, where they come from. It's going to require certainly electricity, cleaning up our electricity supply, which is just about 20% of our greenhouse gas footprint, but also transportation. And the two are obviously very linked as we think about electrifying transportation to try to reduce emissions. So almost 40% of the transportation, of the greenhouse gas emissions in California comes from essentially driving. So I was interested to hear yesterday the difference with Brazil, where here, with all the hydropower that you have and some of the ethanol, your greenhouse gas footprint is different from ours. So the main strategy to try to attack the problem of climate change is first become more efficient with the energy we use. So this is someone doing some duct work, making a house more efficient. For the electricity that we do use, has to come from renewable sources, and then we need to electrify our transportation as much as possible. So electric vehicles are a big part of that. But the renewable energy sector, as we've talked about in the last couple of days, is really the primary driver for energy storage. This goes to our chart that we just talked about a couple presentations about renewable energy mandates in California. So we set a goal originally to get, and by 2010, 20% of our electricity from renewable sources. I want to make one important point. That does not include large hydro. So the law specifically excluded large hydro because policymakers wanted to foster innovation. And if large hydro, if we had good rain years in California, then it would essentially drown out the competition, no pun intended. And we wanted to make sure solar, wind, biomass could compete. Well, we didn't make it in 2010. We made it the next year. But meanwhile, we passed a law that by 2020, we'd get to 33% renewable generation. And you can see we already passed that at 34.8%. So they're talking about bumping that up. And then out to 2030, 50% renewable power. And they're talking about possibly passing a law to bump that up to 60%. And then also pass a law to get to 100% renewable by 2045 in California. So we made this leap of faith in the early days that we could get there. We heard the grid operators, CAISO, say this is going to be really challenging. But we've so far been able to see prices come down, and most of this renewable energy we anticipate will come from solar PV with the dramatic price decreases we've seen there. But the grid operators, CAISO, they've gotten much more sophisticated about how to manage the grid and how to manage the impacts of all this renewable energy. We've talked a lot about the duck curve. Everyone's shown charts with the duck curve, but I think I have the best duck curve chart, so I'll show you why. Okay, this is I don't want to say it's animated, but and I stole this from CAISO, but anyways. So here you got, everyone knows this. This is a typical daily load from California. Let's add in a little wind power. So that green line there is a wind coming in. And let's add in solar. We all know this curve. But this is where the chart gets, I think, pretty fun. So now we can see what the net load is, right? So there's the duck. There's the neck, kind of. I don't know. Does everyone see the duck? Yeah, all right. you know, it's actually the 10-year anniversary of the duck. So I know Dr. Mooney's NREL was the first to come up with that, Paul Denholm over there 10 years ago. So it's kind of happy birthday to the duck. But this is where we get fun here. So the ramps, look at that. This is pretty, for me, this is big-time PowerPoint skills. But the big ramp here in the morning, but then you got to ramp down. So we're, you know, seeing this now, what the impact is from a grid operator perspective. Of course, the huge ramp there, that gets to the clean power peak standard that Lincoln was talking about. And we'll go back to that. So, you know, you can see how the need to manage this. And of course, this is an energy storage conference, but in California, we actually are contemplating 3 ways to manage the duck curve here. And storage is really just one of them. But, you know, the first one is to try to change how people use electricity through demand response. So, you know, we don't have to have that big peak there if people decide to defer things like washing machines, dishwashers, maybe turning some extra lights off in the house. So you can help reduce peaks that way and reduce the need to ramp through demand response, through price signals, but then also as homes become more automated, you know, things like Amazon Alexa and Google Nest that start controlling appliances, you could potentially have a computer program that will respond to price signals and do it for you. So you don't have to remember, oh, I need to set my dryer for 8 o'clock tonight. You know, Alexa will do it for you. So as we start to head in that direction, demand response is important. The second thing is geographic diversity. So in Brazil, we saw the great maps of the transmission lines, taking advantage of solar when the sun is shining somewhere where it's not in the western part of the state, taking advantage of wind resources in the United States and the Rocky Mountains. We have fantastic wind resources. So that's the second way. And the third way, of course, the holy grail would be energy storage to manage this. So now I want to talk about how California has created this market through law and policy for energy storage. And just a quick technology overview that comes from that 2012 report. You know, we defined energy storage as a physical system with the ability to capture energy for dispatch or displacement of electricity use at a later time. And we've seen some definitions, but you sometimes see some shifting definitions of energy storage. Well, obviously, we looked at electrochemical. We called them promising technologies, but we had advanced lead acid, lithium-ion, flow batteries. Mechanical, pumped hydro, compressed air, and flywheels, which are good for short duration in particular. And then thermal with solar thermal and different HVAC, heating, ventilation, and air conditioning applications. And then hydrogen, ultracapacitors, and then superconducting magnetic energy storage. So some different technologies that we haven't necessarily spent a lot of time talking about at this conference, but it shows the breadth of what's out there. So the big thing in California is our mandate. You can't really beat a mandate for creating industry action, and that's what happened in 2010. And the political backstory here is that our now governor, Jerry Brown, who's been governor now for 4 terms, and he's almost done now, is his last year. He was Attorney General back in 2010, and he personally made energy storage a cause. And he sponsored this law and got it passed, and the utilities fought it every step of the way. They absolutely did not want a mandate, and what they were able to do was to basically say, we want our Public Utilities Commission, our regulators, to decide if we need a target or not. So there was no target set in the law, and it became a regulatory process. But the 3 goals behind it for energy storage were to optimize the grid, the things we've talked about, peak reduction, reliability, and also deferring investments in infrastructure. Integrating renewable energy, of course, and then reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So those were the 3 goals, but then the issues were, are we talking about utility versus customer-owned energy storage? And are we going to have off-ramps and flexibility if we find that we've created a mandate and the costs now are suddenly too great? How do we build in flexibility? And then, of course, how much technological innovation can we really count on? So, back in 2010, as probably even now, but especially back then, there's a lot of open questions. There was not any mandate for energy storage anywhere at the time, at least in the United States. Dr. Gravely showed this chart yesterday, but this is what eventually happened. It took until 2013 to actually set the targets. But you can see we came up with this 1.325 gigawatt target for the 3 investor-owned utilities in California. And I heard the chief regulator, Carla Peterman, who was presiding over this proceeding, and she talked about what it was like to have to come up with a number, basically. It could have been anywhere, she said, from 0 to 6,000 megawatts of energy storage. I mean, industry was saying 6,000 megawatts, utilities were saying 0, and she wanted to go sort of cautious and went with 1.325. And it could have been more aggressive. A lot of people felt like should have been 3,000 to 4,000 megawatts for 2020. But as we'll see, this has been built upon. And I should also point out one other thing. To make sure that you don't have a problem of big established technologies like pumped hydro crowding out the market, they divided it into these 3 classes here. So transmission connected energy storage, distribution connected, and then the customer side, to try to allow for innovation within the mandate. And then a series of off-ramps. So every few years you have a check-in, you could set new targets, you can adjust if costs are going up or technology is not progressing as we had hoped. So here's the progress to date. This is a map of where the energy storage projects are around the state. Some predate the mandate. You can see pumped hydro, we already have 4,500 megawatts, and that is in blue there, so you could see some of the blue pumped hydro. Thermal systems, 178 megawatts installed as of December 2016, and that's up from 24 megawatts, so that's really mandate kind of created there. And the thermal storage projects you could see in the red triangles, maybe a little hard to see. Stationary batteries, 147 megawatts, up from 41 megawatts, so a fair amount of growth there. And you can see electrochemical, so a lot of batteries, basically. And then flywheels, we've seen very few as of June 2017, although we expect some more to come online. They're good for those ancillary services. And then compressed air energy storage. As long as I've been working in energy storage, everyone always says there's just 2 of them in the whole world, and that's at least that's true for California at this point. We don't have any compressed air. But there are additional mandates as we saw costs come down. So we added this one, which Dr. Gravely mentioned yesterday, an additional 500 megawatt mandate for behind the meter energy storage. And then we've had 2 nuclear plants in California close. Well, one closed and one is going to close. And to make up for the loss of the nuclear power, the regulators put in requirements for things like more renewables, more energy efficiency, but also more energy storage. So, and we had a bad natural gas leak in Southern California a few years ago, and to make up for the loss of that natural gas, there was an additional energy storage mandate on that gas company to provide. So we found other ways in California to kind of build on that original mandate to require procurement by utilities. But there's another mandate that we've talked a bit about at this conference about zero-emission vehicles. So in California, we've had a zero-emission vehicle mandate for a number of years, where we require every automaker that does business in the state to produce a certain number of zero-emission vehicles, either hydrogen fuel cells, battery electrics, and if they can't produce the vehicles, like we know some automakers, like Volvo, for example, haven't yet produced anything, they have to buy credits from those that are selling. So this has actually really helped companies like Tesla, Nissan with the Nissan Leaf, Chevy has the Bolt and the Volt, and they've been able to get credits, sell their credits from sales. But this has really helped, and you can see the chart here, whoops, I'll go back one. This has really helped drive sales. So there's California's sales of electric vehicles, zero-emission vehicles, and there's the national sales, and you can see the trend lines are very good. And this is one of the, I think in some ways, the results of this kind of mandate-type policy. This is Chevy Bolt. We've talked about electric vehicles and how maybe they're not that convenient, but the reality is this car goes 240 miles, so what is that, 300 kilometers or so, of range on a single charge. You can get it with incentives, or about $30,000 in the United States. And of course, the electricity is typically a lot cheaper than the gasoline. So I actually am leasing this car. I've taken it on a couple of 400-mile road trips already. No problems. There's public infrastructure for charging, fast charging. We need to do better at that. But the point is that electric vehicles are really starting to take hold now with a mass market type vehicle approach. And I know I've been looking around Sao Paulo to see if there's any electric vehicles. I haven't seen them, although you've got the 3 charging stations across the road here. So if anyone does get an electric vehicle, you can charge here, it seems like. And what this has led to, as we've talked about, is there's already out-of-date chart of this incredible price decreases on lithium-ion battery packs, which has really changed the ball game. And we think the electric vehicle mandate and the stimulus around that market has really helped lead to this big, steep decrease. But we've also, anyone know what this is, by the way? Anyone guess? So this is a Nissan Leaf battery. So we also look at this as storage that's, first of all, it's in the vehicles, because the vehicles can, as they plug in, you can manage the charging, and that's a good demand response resource. But they're also producing what eventually will become used electric vehicle batteries. There was a question yesterday about recycling them, but we think there's an opportunity to actually repurpose them. This is a project down at UC San Diego where there's a microgrid. These are taking used BMW electric vehicle batteries and stacking them and repurposing them, because these used batteries, once they come out of the vehicle, still may have a lot of charge left. When we did our report on this subject back in 2014, we estimated that if you took half of the batteries from the vehicles that were on the road in 2014, and just half of them, and let's say they had 75% capacity left, that would be about 425 megawatts of energy storage just driving around the road in 2014 that will eventually come out of the vehicle. So this is basically cheap batteries, cheap energy storage, and law and policy can help create a market for it. So we think that, so you have energy storage not only driving around in the vehicles, but potentially coming out of the vehicles and being able to be repurposed. So besides mandates, because industry doesn't always like mandates, well, the battery industry and energy storage industry likes it, but utilities certainly don't. We have incentives too, and a big incentive was in 2011 we passed a law that allows batteries to take advantage of what's called the self-generating incentive program. It's funded by ratepayers, and basically it allows energy storage customers to get this incentive rebate if they install behind-the-meter storage. So this was a very powerful driver, particularly for behind-the-meter energy storage. And then we had this decision just in January by the Public Utilities Commission to allow stacking of revenues. We've talked a bit about how energy storage can play so many different parts. It can defer investments in distribution or transmission. It can do ancillary services. It can provide load shifting. But you need to be able to stack all of these revenue streams. And it's been really hard in California, at least in the early days, to even define what energy storage is. It's not generation, it's not transmission, it's not distribution. And so this allows it to take advantage of all those revenue streams. And then, as Dr. Gravely talked about yesterday, a lot of research and development dollars going into demonstration projects to prove that these energy storage technologies can work as advertised. They'll provide the dependability and the performance. So some trends and future policy needs. So obviously we've talked a lot about the need for bulk energy storage and making sure that we avoid things like curtailment and enable some of that peak shifting to help get a clean peak. So, it may be that economics can help drive this. As curtailment increases, as Lincoln showed in his presentation, I think solar and other renewable developers are going to have strong incentives to want to invest in energy storage to pair with their projects, so they don't basically have to dump all that extra solar power. The other big one, and we talked a little bit about this in the conference, is microgrids. But also the need for resilience, particularly as we see more extreme weather with climate change. So this is a shot here from a wildfire-caused power outage in the San Diego area. This was back in, I think, 2011. And UC San Diego has a microgrid, and all of San Diego, the city, was dark.
but UC San Diego, with their energy storage system, was able to get started up right away. And we have a very crucial military base in San Diego where their power was off, and the gates to their parking garage wouldn't come up, so their military vehicles couldn't come and go. And that's when the military realized, that if there's a big power outage, that's a national security issue. And so having a microgrid using energy storage for those kinds of events is a national security issue. It's also an important resiliency one, as more wildfires happen, more droughts, more extreme weather. And so that's a big trend where energy storage can play an important role. And then also, of course, backup power. This is a shot of the Fukushima nuclear reactor melting down in Fukushima, Japan. And you think about how much a few batteries would have cost to keep that reactor going and avoid all the damage that we saw from the tsunami. So that's another value stream. And I'd say in California, for individual customers who get a battery system with their solar panels on their roof, if you're a homeowner, for them it's really about that backup power. They're concerned about outages. There's not quite the revenue incentive to invest in the battery, but the backup power is a whole other source of potential monetization. And of course, in California, as we tackle climate change, we don't just want to do this on our own. We're happy to help develop a market for energy storage and try to help optimize the grid, but we're trying to inspire action around the world, learn from other parts of the world. So this is a photo. There's our governor, Jerry Brown, in a signing ceremony for the Under 2 Coalition. So this was right before the 2015 UN Paris Accord. And in the lead up to that, California and Baden-Württemberg, a state in Germany, teamed up to try to sign up subnationals. So cities, states that were willing to be more aggressive on climate than countries and keep the temperature to under 2 degrees Celsius by 2100. So the Under 2 Coalition was born. And here's a map. I think this is the latest map. I'm pleased to say Sao Paulo signed on to this agreement, not just the state of Sao Paulo, but the city. So there we are. But the numbers here are pretty striking in terms of jurisdictions. It's 187 jurisdictions in 38 countries, representing 1.2 billion people, $28.8 trillion GDP, equals 16% of the global population and 39% of the world economy. So all of that under this Under 2 coalition of subnationals like the city and state here, like California, who are really trying to act aggressively on climate. And energy storage is part of that, because as all these countries sign the pledge, or subnationals sign the pledge, implementing it is the next challenge. And we need to share ideas, share our experiences. As Brazil learns things like the biofuels in use here, California learns from that. We can share our energy storage story and go forward that way. I just want to conclude with a few thoughts and an important chart. So this shows in California that since 1990, you can see our 1990 to about 1994, our carbon footprint and gross domestic product were linked. But starting in the mid-90s, our economy grew while our carbon emissions started to decrease. So we think of this as of now, a big success story, that we've been able to show that you can grow an economy without continuing to increase your carbon emissions. But in terms of energy storage, the big questions for us in California is, do we need more mandates to increase the amount of energy storage that we're requiring utilities to procure? We're also trying to grapple with rate design, and are we incentivizing energy storage? In Hawaii, they have ratcheted down their incentives, their net metering incentives for rooftop solar, to the point where it now it pencils out for a customer to get rooftop solar and also get a battery. And the battery pays for itself that way. In California, we're probably going to be heading in that direction as well, to be less generous with our solar incentives. So if you put solar on your roof, you now have an incentive to capture that surplus solar and use it on site through a battery. And then just lastly, that raises questions then about the utility business model going forward. It was mentioned yesterday about grid defection, but at the very least, as we pair solar and storage, whether it's microgrids and community systems or it's an individual building owner, the demand for electricity from the utility, it will be decreasing. And so how we manage that will be an issue going forward. So with that, I'll conclude. I've got a few reports here, and you can access them through these websites as well, and I look forward to question and answer. Thank you for sticking around for the whole conference. So.
Thank you. I have a personal question for you. Did you get somebody to take care of your children? I remember one problem we had for you to come that you... So you solved that problem. So the other question is this. Jerry Brown was the governor during the California rationing, so he learned a lot about energy, looks like. Yeah. Please, I would like to invite my favorite gringos, Lincoln Pratson, Dalia, Ethan, and also I invite Dave Mooney to have all